Lucas sat up a little straighter, alarm rising in his chest. He had heard enough. He wasn't here to make enemies, but if the Sirians were going to make this difficult, then he had no choice. Mira stood, her expression hardening. This human saved my life, Chief Veron. You will not treat him like an outsider. Veron's gaze shifted between the two of them. The tension in the room thickened. Lucas had the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The rest of the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Lucas, still struggling to understand the full scope of what had happened, felt the weight of the situation bear down on him. He had only acted out of instinct, but now, it seemed like he had stepped into something much bigger than he had ever expected. The princess's life was at stake, and now his own was too. As he lay there, his wound still fresh, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of world he had just landed in. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the medical devices keeping Lucas alive. His body felt heavy, his mind foggy from both the poison and the shock of everything that had happened. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his side made him wince. His head was still spinning and his body felt weak, but the adrenaline from his near-death experience had faded, leaving behind a dull ache. Mira remained standing by the door, her eyes flickering with unreadable emotion. She looked like she wanted to say something more, but the tall Sirian warrior, Chief Veron, stood like a statue next to her, his face stern and unyielding. Lucas glanced at both of them, his mind trying to make sense of what was happening. He'd never been in a situation quite like this before. He had been part of many dangerous missions back on Earth, but this was something entirely different. He had saved a princess from an assassination attempt. And now, not only was he at the mercy of the Sirians, but he had also unknowingly become part of their strange, rigid customs. Chief Veron's voice broke the silence, his words sharp. "Princess, this cannot be allowed to stand. The laws of our people are clear. The act he performed, though noble, was an offense to our honor." Mira's gaze shifted to Lucas, her expression softening. "I understand, Veron," she replied calmly, "but we cannot ignore his bravery. He saved my life, and for that, he must be recognized, not punished." Veron's gaze hardened. "Recognition, yes, but punishment, too. He broke our sacred laws. He is an outsider, a foreigner. He cannot simply waltz in and change our traditions." Lucas felt a knot tighten in his chest. He didn't understand the laws or the traditions of these people, but he could feel the weight of their judgment on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that could have consequences for the whole diplomatic mission. Mira took a step closer to him, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "I will speak for you, Lucas. You have nothing to fear from my people. You've proven yourself as an ally, and I will not let them dishonor you for your actions." For a brief moment, Lucas wondered if he had made a mistake. If he had known she was a princess, he might have acted differently. But then his mind quickly pushed that thought aside. It didn't matter now. He had saved her life, and that was all that mattered. Mira turned back to Veron, her voice firm but respectful. "I will speak to the council myself. The decision will not come from you. Chief, you are part of the military. This is not your place." Veron's eyes narrowed. "Very well, princess, but do not think that you can change the will of the council so easily." Mira's gaze never wavered. "I will try." With that, Veron turned on his heel and left the room, leaving the two of them alone. As the door closed behind him, Lucas let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Mira stood for a moment, her back to him, and then she finally turned to face him. Her expression was still serious, but there was something softer in her eyes now, something that Lucas couldn't quite place. She took a step toward him. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly. "You didn't even know who I was." Lucas swallowed, his throat dry. "I couldn't just stand there and let someone get hurt." Mira nodded slowly, her eyes studying him. "Yes, I see that now. And for that, I will always be grateful. But you must understand, this situation, it's complicated. I have my duties, and you have your own obligations. As a soldier, yes." Lucas didn't respond right away. His mind was still spinning, trying to understand the full picture. He had been assigned to this mission as part of the Terran delegation. He was here to ensure the safety of the humans, to protect the team. He wasn't here to get involved in alien politics. As they moved into position, Lucas's mind raced. He wasn't just fighting for Mira anymore. He was fighting for the future of a planet, for the survival of a people who had trusted him, an outsider, to protect them. It was a heavy responsibility, but one he would carry to the end. Outside the doors, the sound of the rebels' march grew louder. The Exarathan were closing in. But this time, Lucas wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. He was going to meet them head-on. "Get ready," Mira said, her voice steady but filled with an unmistakable fire. "The battle isn't over yet. This is just the beginning." Lucas stood tall, gripping his weapon with both hands. He was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the air was thick. The door to the inner chamber shuddered as another blast rocked the palace. Lucas tightened his grip on his weapon. The time for hesitation was over. He had to act, and he had to act fast. The Exarathan were at the gates. "This is it," General Rowe muttered, his eyes sharp as he surveyed the room. "We'll hold them off as long as we can. Protect the princess at all costs." Lucas nodded. The weight of the responsibility settled on his shoulders, but it didn't scare him. In fact, it steeled his resolve. He had been through countless battles, but this one was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about fighting for something larger than themselves. Mira stood with her advisors, her face calm but her eyes betraying the nervous energy within. "We'll fight here," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "We cannot let them breach this room. If we fall back, everything is lost." Lucas could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a leader. And in that moment, she was more than just the figurehead of the Surian people. She was their last hope. The sounds of the battle outside grew louder, more intense. The Exarathan had breached the outer defenses and were making their way deeper into the palace. The soldiers around them were nervous, but they trusted Mira. They trusted her to guide them through this. "Everyone, take your positions," General Rowe ordered, his voice commanding. "We'll fight to the last man if we have to." The soldiers moved into formation, preparing for the fight of their lives. Lucas joined them, his heart racing. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Mira down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. The door to the chamber was reinforced, but Lucas knew it wouldn't hold for long. The Exarathan were determined, and they would stop at nothing to bring down the royal family. But Mira had faith in her people. She had built this kingdom on trust, and now it was time for them to show that they were worthy of it. Suddenly, the door crashed open with a deafening sound. Rebels poured into the room, weapons drawn. The first wave was here. "Protect the princess," General Rowe shouted, his sword raised as he charged forward. The battle erupted in an instant. Blasters fired, energy shields flashed, and the air was filled with the sounds of war. Lucas fought with every ounce of strength he had, his movements quick and decisive. He had trained for moments like this, but there was something different about this fight. The stakes were higher. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for Mira's future, for the future of the Surian people. A rebel charged at him, a blaster aimed directly at his chest. Without hesitation, Lucas lunged forward, knocking the weapon aside before striking the rebel with the hilt of his blade. The rebel fell to the ground with a grunt, but more kept coming. They were relentless, pressing forward with no regard for their own safety. Mira stood behind the front lines, directing the soldiers as they fended off the attackers. She was calm, her orders precise. Her leadership was the anchor that kept her people grounded, even in the chaos of the battle. Lucas couldn't help but admire her strength. She wasn't just a ruler by birthright. She was a warrior, fighting for the survival of everything she held dear. He knew he would follow her to the end. As the battle raged on, the rebels continued to push forward, gaining ground with each passing minute. The Surian defenses were beginning to falter. Lucas could see the weariness in the soldiers' eyes. They were outnumbered, and the energy from their weapons was beginning to run low. "We need to fall back," one of the soldiers shouted, his voice panicked. "We can't hold them off much longer." But Mira's voice cut through the chaos. "No, we fight. We stand together." Her words were like a rallying cry. The soldiers, despite their exhaustion, renewed their efforts. They weren't going to back down, not while she was there, leading them. The escape tunnel was narrow, winding its way deep beneath the palace. Lucas's hand gripped Mira's arm tightly as they moved quickly through the dimly lit passage. The sounds of the battle above them, explosions, screams, the clash of weapons, faded into the distance, but the weight of what was happening pressed heavily on Lucas's chest. The palace was falling, and he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping through their fingers. Mira, despite the chaos, moved with purpose, her eyes forward, and her expression set. She wasn't afraid. She couldn't afford to be. If she showed weakness, her people would lose hope, and that was something she could never allow. "We need to keep moving," Lucas said, his voice urgent. They had to get to the inner chambers, to the safe room where Mira's most trusted allies were waiting. Mira nodded, her pace quickening. "I know. We're almost there." But Lucas wasn't so sure. The rebel forces were inside the palace now. They had broken through the outer defenses and were making their way deeper into the heart of the royal complex. It wouldn't be long before they found the escape tunnel, and when they did, there would be no time left. As they reached the end of the passage, Mira stopped suddenly. Her eyes flickered to the entrance ahead, a metal door leading to the inner chambers. But before she could open it, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. "Hurry," Lucas urged, pushing her forward. The footsteps grew louder, and Lucas's heart raced. He could hear the rebels closing in, their voices carrying through the narrow corridor. There was no time to lose. He reached the door and quickly punched in the code to unlock it. The door slid open with a hiss, and Mira stepped inside. Lucas followed, but as he did, a figure appeared in the doorway. One of the rebels, a masked man holding a blaster. Without thinking, Lucas threw himself at the man, tackling him to the ground before he could fire. The two men struggled on the floor, the rebel's blaster slipping from his grasp. Lucas managed to pin him down, using all his strength to keep the rebel's arms at his sides. "Go, Mira," he shouted. "Get to safety." Mira hesitated, her eyes darting between Lucas and the door. "I can't leave you." "You have to," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the fight raging around them. "We can't win this without you. You need to lead your people." Mira's face tightened with resolve. She knew he was right. She could not let her personal feelings get in the way of the larger battle. With one last look at Lucas, she nodded and bolted through the door, disappearing into the inner chambers. Lucas fought with everything he had, struggling to maintain control of the rebel. The fight was exhausting, but he couldn't afford to lose. If he did, the princess was as good as dead. He tightened his grip, finally managing to knock the rebel unconscious with a swift blow. Breathing heavily, Lucas stood, wiping the sweat from his brow. His heart was still racing, but he didn't have time to catch his breath. He had to protect Mira. He couldn't let her down. He ran through the door and into the inner chambers. The room was filled with Surian soldiers, all ready for a fight. Mira stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her most trusted allies, including General Rowe. "You made it," General Rowe said, his voice a mixture of relief and urgency. "We've prepared the defenses, but we need to act quickly." Lucas nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "Where is Mira?" Rowe pointed to the far side of the room, where Mira was speaking with her advisors. Her face was calm, But Lucas could see the strain in her posture. She was doing her best to stay strong, but he knew she was under an immense amount of pressure. As they moved toward her, Mira turned to face them, her expression determined. "The Exarathan are closing in," she said, her voice sharp. "But we're not going to surrender. We will fight for our people." Lucas felt a surge of respect for her. Despite the overwhelming odds, she wasn't backing down. "What's the plan?" he asked. Mira glanced at General Rowe, who gave a small nod. "We'll hold the line here. The safe room is just beyond these doors. If we can buy enough time, we can evacuate the civilians and regroup." Lucas knew it wouldn't be easy. The Exarathan were well organized and ruthless. They wouldn't give up easily, but Mira's plan gave them a chance, however slim. And with everything at stake, he knew he had to do everything in his power to make sure it worked. "Let's do it." The soldiers gathered around, readying their weapons and preparing for the inevitable fight. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew what was at stake. If they lost, it would mean the end of the Sarayan royal family. It would mean the end of everything they had fought for. The sound of more rebels flooding into the room was deafening. Lucas felt his heart pounding in his chest as he fought back to back with the Sarayan warriors. His focus never wavered, but he couldn't ignore the nagging thought that kept creeping into his mind. What if they lost? But he refused to entertain the thought. The only option now was victory. He couldn't afford to think about defeat, not when Mira's life and the future of the Sarayan people was at stake. The battle had reached its peak. The rebels were almost on top of them. But just as it seemed the end was near, the sound of reinforcements arrived. The sound of ships in the sky, landing with a heavy thud, echoed through the palace. "It's them," a soldier shouted, pointing toward the sky. Syrian warships, flying overhead, began to unload their forces. They had arrived. Mira's face lit up with hope. "We're not finished yet," she shouted. With the arrival of the reinforcements, the tide of the battle began to shift. The Exarathan rebels, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated. It was all the opening the Sarayan forces needed. General Rowe rallied his troops. "Push them back. Now is our chance." Lucas felt a surge of adrenaline. They weren't just defending anymore. They were fighting back. Together, the Sarayan soldiers and their new allies pushed forward, overwhelming the remaining rebels. The battle was far from over, but with the reinforcements on their side, the Syrians finally had the strength to reclaim the palace. As the last of the rebels were driven from the room, the soldiers let out a collective cheer. Lucas, panting and covered in sweat, lowered his weapon. The room was filled with the sounds of victory, but the war was far from over. Mira stood at the center of the room, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She had led her people through the battle, and they had emerged victorious. "We've won this battle," she said, her voice steady. "But there is still more to do. The Exarathan will not give up easily. We need to prepare for what comes next." Lucas nodded. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. He was ready for whatever came next. With Mira at the helm, they would fight until the end. The battle for the Sarayan capital was far from over, but the enemy's strength was beginning to falter. With the arrival of reinforcements, the Exarathan rebels had been pushed back, but there was no time for celebration. The real war was just beginning. The Exarathan had already shown their determination, and they wouldn't stop until they had toppled the Sarayan royal family. Mira stood at the balcony of the palace, her eyes focused on the horizon. The warships were still in the sky, watching over the city. Their presence was a comforting sight, but the battle was not yet won. The Exarathan would return. She could feel it in her bones. Beside her, Lucas stood, his eyes scanning the battlefield below. His face was marked with exhaustion, but he remained alert. They had fought together for days, and now, after the first wave of attacks, the rebels were regrouping, preparing for their next strike. It was only a matter of time before they came back with greater force. We won this round, Mira said softly, though her voice held the weight of 1,000 worries. But the war is far from over. Lucas nodded, his gaze still fixed on the distant land. We'll be ready, he replied. We won't let them take this place. Not while you're here. Mira turned to him, her expression softening. I couldn't have made it this far without you. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but full of gratitude. You've given everything to help us. Lucas smiled faintly, though there was little joy in his expression. I'm not doing this for thanks. I'm doing this because you deserve to have a future. The Sarayan people deserve a future. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. The weight of the situation hung heavy between them, but they both knew that there was no turning back now. Mira, Lucas said, his voice low but steady. What will you do when this is all over? When the war is won? Mira's eyes flickered to the distant horizon again, her mind clearly racing. I've thought about that, she said quietly. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing. I will rebuild. I will make sure the Sarayan people have the future they deserve, the future they fought for. The sun blazed down on the lush green planet of Vanera 6, casting long shadows from the towering trees. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, and the hum of alien wildlife echoed in the distance. The Terran expedition had arrived only a few days ago, excited to make peaceful contact with the Sarayans, an alien species known for their ancient traditions and advanced technology. The goal was simple: to create a bond, to offer trade, and to learn from one another. Lucas stood at the edge of the gathering, his eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't here to make friends, not exactly. As part of the security detail, his job was clear: protect the team, stay alert, and ensure nothing went wrong. He had been to countless worlds, but there was something different about this one. The Sarayans were nothing like the humans back home. Their culture, their ways, were as mysterious as the thick jungles that surrounded them. The delegation was led by Ambassador Harry, who stood proudly in front of the group, making her way toward the grand ceremonial hall. It was a huge structure built from stone and crystal, reflecting the Sarayans' impressive mastery of both technology and nature. The path leading to the hall was lined with towering statues of Sarayan warriors, their faces carved into the rock, eyes cold and stern. As they approached, Lucas noticed something strange. The Sarayan warriors lining the path seemed tense, their eyes fixed on the group of humans. Lucas had dealt with hostile situations before, but this felt different. He felt a knot form in his stomach. Something was about to happen. He wasn't wrong. Without warning, a figure stepped out from the crowd, moving with incredible speed. A glint of silver flashed in the sunlight. An assassin's spear. The deadly weapon flew through the air with deadly precision, aimed directly at the woman walking just ahead of Lucas. Mira, the princess of the Sarayans, stood there, unaware of the danger. Lucas' heart skipped a beat. Everything seemed to slow down. Without thinking, he leaped forward, shoving the princess out of the way with all his strength. But as he did, the spear struck him instead, driving deep into his side. Pain exploded through his body, and his vision blurred. The world around him spun, and for a moment, everything went dark. Lucas regained consciousness to find himself in a strange, dimly lit room. The air smelled sterile, like metal and chemicals. His side burned, the pain from the spear wound still throbbing. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. His head swam, and he collapsed back onto what felt like a soft bed. A soft voice cut through his foggy thoughts. You are awake. Good. He turned his head, struggling to focus. A woman stood near his bedside, her eyes concerned but strangely calm. She was dressed in rich, ceremonial robes, a deep purple and gold. He recognized her instantly, though he couldn't place her name. She was the woman from the delegation, the one who had almost been killed. The princess. Who are you? He rasped, his voice weak. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. I am Mira, Princess Mira of the Sorians. You saved my life. Lucas' mind raced as he tried to process what had happened. The spear, he remembered it, flying through the air like a bolt of lightning. And then the pain. But the princess had said he had saved her life. He looked at her, confused. What happened? He asked, his voice hoarse. Mira looked at him, her face serious but not unkind. You were wounded by the spear. It is poisoned. You should not have survived, but we have the means to heal. She paused, glancing at the intricate devices around the room. Our healers worked quickly. You are lucky. Lucas' mind struggled to stay clear. He had saved her life, and now he was lying here, on this strange world, surrounded by aliens. But there was more. He could see it in her eyes, the way she regarded him. You were not supposed to do that, she continued, her voice quieter now. You should have stayed back. Our people, we do not accept interference like this. She looked down, as if she regretted saying it. But your actions, they were honorable. I cannot ignore that. Lucas nodded slowly. He didn't care about their traditions, not right now. He cared about one thing, surviving. But something about the princess's words stuck with him. They didn't accept interference. What did that mean? Before he could ask, the door to the room opened, and a tall, stern-looking Syrian entered. His armor was a deep bronze, and his face was set in a permanent scowl. His eyes narrowed when he saw Lucas. Princess, the matter of the outsider's actions needs to be addressed. We cannot allow this to go unanswered. His voice was cold and authoritative. This human, he violated our customs. We will be forced to take action. Her words were filled with conviction, and Lucas could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't just the princess anymore. She was a leader, and she would do whatever it took to see her people thrive. Before either of them could say anything else, General Rowe appeared at the door, his face grim. The Exarathan are regrouping, he said. They're planning another assault. It's going to be worse this time. Mira turned to face him, her expression hardening. Then we'll be ready. We won't let them break us. General Rowe nodded, but there was a somber look in his eyes. We need to prepare for the worst. They have new allies. We don't know how many more forces they've brought with them. Lucas's heart sank. New enemies. That was the last thing they needed. What can we do? He asked, his voice filled with urgency. General Rowe's eyes narrowed. We hold the palace. We fight for every inch. We will give our lives for this place. And for Mira. Mira stepped forward, her face fierce. We will fight, General. We will not back down. Not now. Not ever. The resolve in her voice was unshakable. It was the sound of a leader who had made her choice. She would never surrender. The next few hours were spent preparing for the inevitable. Soldiers ran drills, checked their weapons, and reinforced the defenses. Mira held several meetings with her most trusted advisors, discussing strategy and preparing for the next wave of attacks. The palace was a beehive of activity, everyone working in perfect harmony to secure the future of the Sorian people. Lucas joined the soldiers at the front lines, training with them, and ensuring they were ready for whatever came next. The energy in the air was different now. They weren't just defending anymore. They were preparing for the final confrontation. The Exarathan might have more forces, but the Sorians had something the rebels didn't: unity. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the palace, Lucas found himself standing beside Mira once more, looking out over the battlefield. The calm before the storm. The quiet before the final fight. Whatever happens, Mira said, her voice calm but strong, we stand together. We fight together. Lucas nodded, his jaw set. Together. As the night drew in, the Sorian forces prepared for their final stand. The Exarathan would come at them with everything they had, but they were ready. Mira, Lucas, and the Sorian people would not back down. This was their home, their future, and they would fight for it until their last breath. The battle would be fierce, the outcome uncertain, but one thing was clear: the Sorians were not alone. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would find hope in the darkness. And with that, Lucas knew that no matter what happened in the coming battle, they had already won. The fight for their future had begun, and they would never give up. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about him anymore. He had made a choice that had consequences, and whether he liked it or not, he was now part of something much bigger. Mira continued, her voice steady. "I am not just a princess, Lucas. I am the heir to the throne of the Sorian people. Every decision I make carries weight. Every action I take affects the future of my people." Lucas felt a pang of guilt in his chest. "I didn't mean to complicate things." Mira's eyes softened. "I know you didn't, but now you are part of my story. And my people's story. You can't walk away from that." Lucas took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had saved her life, yes, but at what cost? He wasn't ready to become part of a political struggle. He was just a soldier, a human soldier. But as he looked into Mira's eyes, he realized that his fate was now tied to hers in a way he hadn't expected. Mira sat down on a chair beside his bed, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. "I will speak to the council," she said again, more to herself than to him. "I will try to make them understand. You will not be punished, but it will take time. There are others who may not be as understanding as I am." Lucas nodded slowly, his thoughts still churning. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: the decisions he had made in the heat of the moment had changed everything. And now he was part of a much bigger story than he had ever imagined. As Mira rose to leave, she gave him a final glance over her shoulder. "Rest, Lucas. The road ahead will not be easy, but we will face it together." For the first time since he had arrived on Vanera 6, Lucas allowed himself to relax. He was far from safe, but at least he wasn't alone. The days that followed were filled with tension. Lucas wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing for certain: Mira's position was more than just ceremonial. She held real power, and the way she spoke about her responsibilities made it clear that her people expected more from her than anyone could imagine. He spent the next few days resting and recovering, his body healing under the care of the Sorian healers. They were experts in both medicine and technology, and the poison from the spear had been neutralized quickly. But the longer he stayed in the palace, the more he could sense the unease among the Sorian people. Whispers filled the halls, and everywhere he went, people seemed to watch him closely. Lucas wasn't used to being watched. On Earth, he was just another soldier, another face in a crowd. Here, on Vanera 6, he was different. He was an outsider, an anomaly that could upset the delicate balance of Sorian politics. Mira didn't seem bothered by the tension. Every day, she visited him, bringing him food or talking with him about the culture and the people. It was clear she was trying to build a bridge between the Sorians and the humans, but it wasn't easy. Many of the council members had questioned her decision to spare him. Some even argued that his interference in the assassination attempt had dishonored their customs. Yet there was something about her that Lucas couldn't quite shake. Despite the pressure she was under, Mira remained calm, focused, and determined. He admired that. And over time, he began to realize that he wasn't just looking at a princess. He was looking at a leader, someone who would do whatever it took to protect her people. But the political situation was getting worse. One evening, as they sat in a quiet room discussing the Sorian ways, Mira turned to him with a serious expression. "There is more at stake here than you realize, Lucas." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "More than you, me, and a poisoned spear." Mira nodded, her eyes darkening. "Yes, the assassination attempt was not an isolated event. It is part of a larger plot. Someone is trying to overthrow my family and take control of the throne." The weight of her words settled in the room. Lucas felt his pulse quicken. Who would want to do that? he asked, trying to make sense of it all. Mira hesitated before answering. There are factions within my people who believe that the Syrian royal family has become weak. They want to replace my father with someone they consider more suited to lead. She clenched her fists at her sides. Some believe that humans, like you, could be useful allies in that cause. Lucas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had hoped this would be just a simple mission. Help the Syrians, make allies, and go home. But now, it seemed like he was caught in a dangerous game he hadn't signed up for. So, what happens now? He asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. Mira met his gaze. Now, we fight. The words hung in the air for a long moment. Lucas wasn't sure what to expect from her, but the resolve in her eyes told him everything. Mira wasn't going to back down. And if he wanted to help her, he couldn't either. The next few days were a blur of meetings and hurried preparations. Mira had called a meeting with the most loyal members of her court, those who still believed in the royal family and in her leadership. Lucas was introduced to some of these people, including General Rowe, a seasoned Syrian warrior with a stern face and a sharp mind. Rowe had little patience for politics and no interest in the intricate customs of his people. His only focus was on one thing: protecting Mira, no matter the cost. You saved the princess, General Rowe said to Lucas one evening, his voice gruff. That act alone has made you part of this. You have no choice now. Lucas nodded, acknowledging the truth in Rowe's words. He didn't have a choice. Not anymore. The general continued. There are rebels growing in number. The Exarethan faction believes that the Syrians have failed, that we are too tied to our traditions. They see you, humans, as a way to strengthen their cause. He leaned in, his eyes piercing. They will come for us, and when they do, we must be ready. Lucas felt the weight of those words. How do we stop them? He asked. Rowe's lips curled into a grim smile. We fight back. The only way to stop the Exarethan is to show them that the Syrians are stronger than they think. And so the preparation began. Mira, General Rowe, and a few trusted allies worked tirelessly to gather information, fortify the palace, and prepare for an attack. Lucas, despite being an outsider, was drawn into it all. He was trained for combat, and even though this wasn't his fight, it had become personal. He had made a promise when he saved Mira's life, and he wasn't going to break it. Over the next few days, the palace was transformed into a fortress. The once serene halls were now filled with soldiers, preparing for an enemy that could strike at any moment. Tension ran high, but Mira remained calm, always moving with purpose. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Lucas found himself in the palace courtyard, sharpening his weapons. He had never fought in a place like this before, alien territory, surrounded by creatures and cultures he didn't fully understand. But the weight of his promise to protect Mira pushed him forward. As he worked, General Rowe approached him, his eyes scanning the courtyard. You've trained well, Lucas. You're a quick learner, he said, his voice low. Lucas looked up at him. I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to protect her. Rowe gave a small nod of approval. That's the right attitude. Remember, this is no longer just about us. It's about everything that comes after. The fate of the Syrians, and maybe even humanity, rests on what we do next. Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He was no longer just a soldier. He was part of something much larger, a war for survival, not just for his people, but for Mira's as well. And when the Exarethan finally made their move, he would be ready. The calm before the storm was always the hardest. Lucas spent the next few days in a state of constant vigilance. He wasn't used to waiting, to preparing for something he didn't fully understand. The Syrian warriors had their own ways of fighting, strategies, tactics, and weapons far different from anything he had seen on Earth. But despite the differences, the one thing they all shared was the same goal: survival. Mira worked tirelessly to rally her supporters. The palace had become a hive of activity, with guards posted at every door and soldiers running drills in the courtyards. The Exarethan rebels, once a small faction, had grown in strength and now posed a real threat to the throne. Their spies had infiltrated the capital, and they were waiting for the right moment to strike. Lucas had never been involved in a war on this scale. The battles he had fought in the past had been straightforward, clear enemies, and even clearer objectives. Here, things were more complicated. It wasn't just about who controlled the land. It was about power, honor, and the future of a people. He had saved Mira's life, but now he was fighting not just for her, but for the survival of the Surayan way of life. One evening, as dusk settled over the palace, Mira entered the war room, her face drawn with worry. Lucas stood up from his seat, glancing at her. The weariness in her eyes was more than just physical fatigue. It was the burden of leadership. "I've spoken with the council again," she said, her voice low but steady. "They are divided. Some still don't believe we can win. Some say we should negotiate with the Exarethan." Lucas frowned, his hand gripping the hilt of his blade. "And what do you believe?" Mira met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I believe they're wrong. We cannot show weakness. If we give in, we lose everything." Lucas nodded. "Then we fight. We'll stand with you." Mira's lips curled into a small, grateful smile, though it was tinged with worry. "Thank you, Lucas. Your loyalty means more than you know." That night, they received word that the Exarethan had launched their first attack. The capital was under siege, and the rebel forces had begun their assault on the outer walls. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Surayan defenses were still being fortified, and the palace was vulnerable. General Rowe immediately gathered his soldiers, preparing them for battle. Lucas was no longer just an outsider. He was now an ally in this fight. His role had become clear: protect Mira at all costs. The princess wasn't just a figurehead. She was the heart of the Surayan people, and if she fell, so did the hope of victory. Lucas donned his armor and followed General Rowe to the front lines. The palace walls were lined with defenders, but it was clear that the Exarethan outnumbered them. The first wave of rebels had already breached the outer defenses, and the battle had begun. The air was thick with the sounds of war: clashing metal, shouting soldiers, and the roar of blasters. Lucas had fought in many battles before, but the chaos of this one felt different. The stakes were higher, the enemies more ruthless. These rebels weren't just after territory, they were after everything. Mira stood at the heart of the command center, coordinating the defenses with a calm precision that amazed Lucas. Her voice rang out, giving orders to the soldiers, guiding them where to go and what to do. It was clear that she wasn't just the princess of the Surayans. She was their leader, their protector. But even her strength couldn't stop the tide of battle. As the Exarethan advanced, they began to overwhelm the Surayan forces. The rebel soldiers fought fiercely, using every trick and tactic to gain ground. The Surayan defenses, while strong, were not prepared for the sheer number of enemies charging at them. At the front lines, Lucas and General Rowe led a small group of elite soldiers in a desperate attempt to hold the rebels back. The battle was chaotic, and it was hard to tell who was winning. In the midst of the fighting, Lucas saw the familiar flash of enemy blasters and the sharp crack of energy weapons firing in all directions. One of the rebels charged at him, his blade raised high. Lucas parried the strike with his own weapon, countering with a quick thrust to the enemy's chest. The rebel fell, but more kept coming. The Surayans were being pushed back, and the rebels were gaining ground. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. He had to hold the line. They had to buy time for Mira, for the council, for the future of the Surayan people. Suddenly, a loud explosion rang out from the far side of the palace. The shockwave sent Lucas stumbling to the ground. The outer walls had been breached. The Exarethan had found a weakness, and now they were inside. "We have to fall back," General Rowe shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the battlefield. Protect the princess. Without hesitation, Lucas turned and ran toward the command center. His heart raced as he pushed through the chaos, fighting his way past rebels and soldiers alike. He had to get to Mira. She couldn't be left alone. When he arrived at the command center, he found Mira standing firm, her eyes steely with determination. She was surrounded by her most trusted advisors, but the pressure of the situation was taking its toll on her. "We're losing, Mira," Lucas said, his voice urgent. "We need to fall back to the inner palace. It's the only safe place left." Mira shook her head, her expression unwavering. "We will not retreat. Not yet." But before she could say anything more, the door to the command center exploded open. A group of rebels poured in, weapons raised. The fight was no longer on the walls. It was here, in the heart of the palace. "Get her out of here," Lucas shouted to the soldiers nearby. He grabbed Mira by the arm, pulling her toward the secret escape route that led deeper into the palace. As they moved through the narrow corridors, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The Exarethan were closing in, and the Surians were losing their grip on the battle. They needed a miracle.